Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our author series tonight with Gary Fogel. I'd also like to thank our focal group, Friends of Corrales Library, for sponsoring our Zoom Pro platform. Gary B. Fogel is an adjunct professor of aerospace engineering at San Diego State University and the CEO of Natural Selection, Inc. He's also the author of many books: Quest for Flight, John J. Montgomery and the Dawn of Aviation in the West, The Torrey Pines Gilderport, and Wind and Wings, The History of Soaring in San Diego. But tonight we will be talking about his book, Skyrider. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Sandra. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'll just get set up. Just let me know, can you see the screen okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'm here to talk to you about a book that I've just written, Skyrider, Park Van Tassel and the Rise of Ballooning in the West, a biography of this gentleman, Park Van Tassel, and his exploits in New Mexico and other locations. So New Mexico itself has a fantastic and rich history with hot air ballooning, modern hot air ballooning, especially at the Fiesta that happens every October. I had the pleasure of being out there last October to witness this and have 300 balloons over my head in the sky. And we take it for granted, all this color and the beauty and how easy it is to get in a hot air balloon and come back and land at the location we want. It wasn't always that way. And so part of today's talk is to take you back in time and put you back at a time when even heavier than air flight was still impossible, and lighter than air ballooning was still something that was very, very, very magical. Not that it isn't magical today, but incredibly magical. And it wasn't that long ago. So if we think about it, in 1783, the first hot air balloon flight with a human on board was made by the Montgolfier brothers in France. It took about 10 years for that technology to get across the Atlantic Ocean, with the Frenchman Blanchard making the first balloon flight in the US in 1792 in front of George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson were all there to watch this. It was the equivalent of a SpaceX launch, so you got to go watch this thing happen. First person to go aloft in America's history. And in addition, in 1797, a gentleman, another Frenchman named Garnerin, made the first parachute jump out of a balloon. Went up in a balloon, jumped out the side, back down in a parachute for the first time. It was a rigid parachute that survived the fall. And again, it took some time for that technology to come across the Atlantic Ocean to the eastern United States, with a gentleman named Louis Gill making the first parachute jump in the US in 1819 in New York. And balloons were used throughout the period of the 1800s for exhibition, for use in the Civil War, for reconnaissance. It took a long time for that technology to come all the way across America to the American West. The first recorded flight of a balloon in the American West, west of the Rockies, was a gentleman, a 16-year-old, by the name of Joseph Gates, who kind of snuck on board a hot air balloon, went for a flight, and survived the flight in 1853 out of Oakland, California. But that was all very challenging. And ballooning came all the way across the West for the gold rush with technology. It took a long time for that technology to get back around through the American West, back to New Mexico. And part of the story I'm going to talk to you about today is this gentleman, Park Van Tassel, who made a lot of that history of taking ballooning through the American West and his exploits. So the same time that this young gentleman, 16-year-old, was making a flight for the first time in California in 1853, Park Van Tassel was born that year in Indiana. And he encountered balloons as a child at a village fair in Ohio, was captivated by this idea of people being able to go up into the sky. He married a woman named Elizabeth Spencer at an early age. They had one son, a gentleman named Guy Van Tassel, but that marriage did not last long, and we're not exactly sure what happened to Guy Van Tassel. I ask you, as we go through this lecture, to keep count of the number of wives, because the number of wives keeps increasing as I go through the story. In 1879, he moves west. He goes to Stockton, California, in the northern part of California. He marries again a lady named Ella Block in San Joaquin, California, and they have a son named Harry. It's not clear what becomes of him, but what is clear is that while he's in Northern California, he finds a gentleman named F.F. Martin in San Francisco, who was a well-known balloon experimenter at the time, and he buys a very large balloon from Martin. He tries to make an ascension at Stockton and another one in Sacramento, but he can't get it to work. These are very large balloons, typically either gas-powered, gas-fill inflated, or held over a fire, and then the smoke and the hot air from the fire will make the balloon expand. You go up in the balloon. He had a very hard time getting that to work, and both were considered to be a big fizzle in the newspapers at the time. So he really wanted to get into this, but he couldn't figure out how to do it. And at that time, there's not a lot of instruction manuals that go along with this stuff. You buy it and you hope it works and you try to figure it out. And you're really risking your life as you make these kinds of experiments. He and his wife, Ella, moved to Albuquerque in July of 1881 on the train. They set up a tavern. He was a barkeep at the Elite Tavern in the Opera House in what is now downtown Albuquerque. That is on the northwest corner of 2nd Street and Railroad Avenue. His last name was spelled Van Tassel with 1 L, but so many people always spelled it with 2 L's that he starts adopting that last name in his advertising for the bar. But not to be very far from his balloon, he shipped a balloon from San Francisco by rail, interested in still trying to make a flight. And at that time, no one had ever flown anything in New Mexico territory. Here's a picture of what New Mexico looked like at that time. This is about circa 1882. And you can see it's definitely the Old West. So he makes a proclamation that on Independence Day, July 4th, 1882, he's going to make and try to make a balloon ascension. This is widely advertised in Albuquerque, right at 2nd Street between Railroad and Gold Avenues in what was then called Newtown. It's downtown today. This was using coal gas to inflate the balloon. So the coal gas was used in Albuquerque as illuminating gas to light the buildings, light the little gas buildings, gas lights around the buildings at the time. And that was a brand new technology for Albuquerque at that time. This balloon took so much coal gas that it required 2 days of the entire city's gas to fill this balloon, only to about 2/3 full. So that inflation started on July 3rd. By July 4th, it's only 2/3 full. It gets to be 6 o'clock at night into the evening. And everyone's wondering, is Park Van Tassel actually going to go up in this thing or not? And he decides to take all the ballast out of the balloon, go up with whatever gas he has, because he's going to make this ascension because he said he would. And he launches, he goes up to 14,000 feet as measured by a barometer on board the balloon, and comes back down to a landing near Old Town. Not only is this Van Tassel's first successful flight in a balloon, it's the first successful flight by anyone in all of New Mexico. This was a very daring thing because as he's taking out all the ballast or most of the ballast on the way up just to simply get aloft, that means that on the way back down, he can't be throwing out ballast to decrease his rate of descent. So the way back down was pretty fast, and he was lucky to have survived. Here's a picture of that inflation. It's the only picture we have of the balloon at that site on July 4th in 1882 in front of his launch location, with everyone holding onto the netting to keep this thing from blowing away. We've done some investigation. There's 2 gentlemen that have helped me on this trail of history, a gentleman named Dick Brown, who's a Hall of Fame balloonist, and Rick Van Tassel, an indirect descendant of Park Van Tassel. And together, we pieced together this story. We also had found the actual launch location. And if you're familiar with downtown Albuquerque, you know 2nd Avenue and Gold Avenue. And that's now a parking lot right here where the launch site was. Given the success, people in Las Vegas, New Mexico, which is to the northeast of Albuquerque, asked to see if Van Tassel could come and give a demonstration there. It's a little bit higher up than Albuquerque. And he tried to make this ascension in August of 1882, but strong winds damaged the balloon. And on another attempt, the gas that was provided from the town just wasn't enough to even make the balloon really rise very much with the pilot's weight. So he couldn't get it to work at all. It was a flop. He returned to Albuquerque to try to make a second ascension at the 2nd annual New Mexico Territorial Fair. And as they were handling the balloon to get it ready for launch, unfortunately, the balloon became so difficult to control, it got out of the control of the hands of the handlers, and it escaped and went aloft with no one on board. Way up high, came back down on its own, no Van Tassel. Yet another bust for Van Tassel. And after that event, Albuquerque was really kind of, is this guy a fraud? Is he for real? Does he know what he's doing? And Van Tassel had really just gotten started. Again, no instruction manual, he's learning by doing. The town kind of said, you're kind of a fraud. Is this working or not? He left Albuquerque. Ella left to go to California, and Park left to go to Utah. So it's not clear if they had a falling out at the same time or not, but Park was determined to make this work, and actually starting to think about making ballooning and traveling with balloons in exhibitions as his career. He takes off and he goes to Salt Lake City. And on July 4th of the following year, 1883, he makes what's believed to be the first successful ascension by balloon in Utah's history, a flight with a monkey as his passenger up to 15,000 feet from Washington Square. This building today is still at Washington Square. He makes a second flight later in July with a lady named Mrs. Fanny Hoyt. And they have a wonderful flight, 6.5 hours in the balloon over the nearby Wasatch Range. It's a magical flight. It's Van Tassel's best flight by far. But what made the news was that Van Tassel, a married man, had taken someone else's wife up into the balloon, up into the sky for 6.5 hours. It wasn't that he made a great flight. So he was, what's he doing with this other person's wife? After that, he came back down, left for San Francisco. Right away, he leaves San Francisco and goes on another tour. This time of the Northwest, he goes to Oregon. He makes what's believed to be the first balloon flight in Portland's history in September of 1883. Several other ascensions in the Oregon area. One at Salem, a fantastic ascension at the State Fair, 9,000 feet, covering 5 miles in 50 minutes. Really starting to make a name for himself and understanding how to do this ballooning safely. He makes further ascensions at San Francisco and Stockton and Los Angeles in 1884. And he makes a very large new balloon called the Eclipse. This thing is 58 feet in diameter, 110 feet tall, enough to have 3 people on board in the basket. And it's test flown at a ballpark called Central Park in what is now downtown San Francisco at 8th and Market Streets in November 1884. That test flight has Park Van Tassel and 2 other passengers on board. And they launch from San Francisco and they fly out and the winds take them out over San Francisco Bay. He makes a long meandering flight all over San Francisco Bay. The winds just can't take him off out of the bay. He's stuck out over the water. He really waits until it's starting to get sunset. You got to land somewhere. And unfortunately, they have to land in the bay, requiring a boat rescue. On the way down, the gentlemen are taking off all their clothes. They try to figure out anything they can throw off to stay up in the air longer. And so they end up landing in the bay, getting rescued. This is such a success, though, despite the landing, that he conceptualizes that this balloon is so large that you could take a launch from San Francisco and fly all the way over the Sierra Nevada mountains. And that kind of thinking, that was science fiction at the time, that kind of thinking made national news, that someone thought that they could cross the Sierra Nevada in a balloon was so heretical at the time. He's really starting to make a name for himself. Such a name that the World's Fair, which happened to be going on in New Orleans at that time, hired Park Van Tassel to come out to New Orleans to give a demonstration of ballooning. This was on March 19th of 1885. Once again, he has difficulty getting enough gas to inflate this balloon to have enough lifting power to carry him aloft very, very high. He can only fly to about 4,000 feet before it equilibrates in the end and stays up at that altitude. And in New Orleans, the river, the Mississippi River, makes a big horseshoe bend. He launches from one side of the river and lands in a swamp on the west side of the river. But as he's getting out of the balloon in the swamp, the balloon takes back off again and jumps across the river and gets to the other side of the river and stops, requiring a rescue of his balloon. He finally brings it back. Again, favorable national press for having done such a wonderful flight at the World's Fair. But he comes back to San Francisco, and directly after this great event for his ballooning career, he divorces Ella Park, his wife, and rather quickly marries another woman, Clara Kuykendall, wife number 3. And Clara came from a very well-to-do high society family in San Jose. And her parents were not at all pleased that she was marrying this traveling exhibitionist balloon guy. That's not really much of a career. So they forbid the wedding. They got married anyway. They didn't attend the wedding, didn't want anything to do with the wedding, or in Park Van Tassel. But because of all the wedding talk, Park Van Tassel wondered, hey, I could use tethered balloons and take couples aloft that could get married in the sky. If a pastor would go up with us, we have enough room in this balloon now to go up and get married in the air. And that act kept going for a little bit in the Bay Area. These weddings that were by tethered balloon. It was very difficult to find pastors that were willing to go up into the sky in this balloon. He makes another tour of the West. In Los Angeles on July 4th, again, of 1886, he makes a great 1-hour flight with 2 passengers over the city, another similar flight the next day. And now he's proposing, because he's starting to understand air currents a little bit better, a flight in a balloon all the way across America, from Los Angeles all the way to the East Coast. Again, science fiction at the time, but still making a name for himself or thinking that these things might be possible, making the impossible possible. He travels to Denver to give an exhibition, again, helping to explain ballooning and show ballooning to the West. And at Denver, at the high altitude of Denver, again, the gas is so difficult to find and not enough to get really a lot of inflated. He can only make a very short flight up to about 100 feet. And some people were saying, hey, you said you were going to go to 1,000 feet and it's only 100 feet. What is this? Is he really a fraud? Is he really right? But this was credited as the first balloon flight in Colorado's history. He continued on to make an ascension at Kansas City, Missouri. But as he's making this career, this exhibition career, it's very much the same as Buffalo Bill Cody or these other people who were doing traveling exhibitions at the time. He was asking people to pay money to come watch him do these exploits. And you would pay a nickel or a dime, whatever the cost was, to come inside an enclosure that was close to where the balloon was being inflated. And you could watch and be a part of the inflation. And then you get to see the balloon go right up next to you. But of course, it's a balloon, so it's going to launch. People can stand right outside the enclosure and not have to pay anything and see the balloon go. So why pay the money? And at Kansas City, roughly about 90% of the audience was standing outside the enclosure. Only 10% was inside. A police officer manned the entryway, and Park went to ask the police officer, can you please help pull people in, because it's the way I pay to keep my exhibitions going. And the police officer said, no, it's not my job to do that. That's your job. They actually got in an altercation, and it was such an altercation that Park got arrested. He had to get out of jail and then make a balloon ascension to keep going, to keep his finances going, which he did. So really, he was going from town to town, trying to make enough money out of this new environment to go to the next town, to continue this traveling exhibition of ballooning, aerial exhibition. And during that time, the whole time he's doing this, he's wondering, what can I add to my traveling exhibition that people would pay more money to see? What's the next best thing I can do? Because ballooning is now not just impossible. People have seen it. It's now national news that it's possible. And people are kind of like, okay, ballooning is ballooning. What's next? He comes back with the idea of doing a parachute drop from the balloon. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, people had done that already. But in the West, no one had known that people had done that already. That was a new idea. And people might pay more money to see someone jump out of the balloon with a parachute. He came back to San Francisco. And at that time, a gentleman named Thomas Baldwin was doing a tightrope act at the Cliff House, which is a very famous house on the west side of San Francisco on the ocean, and doing a tightrope act on a rope that went all the way from the Cliff House out to the Seal Rocks out here over the water. Very brave, no net, and he was a very brave man. Also a very shrewd capitalist and recognizing how to make money from people with these kind of daring acts. Baldwin heard about Van Tassel's interest in parachuting and wanted to do that too, because he realized that there'd be money in the act. So they teamed up. And at the Mechanics Pavilion, which was a very large building in downtown San Francisco, no longer exists, unfortunately, they began experimenting with parachutes, different designs, throwing them from the top of the rafters to see which one would land safely below, and then deciding to jump themselves for just short little hops to see if it would work or not. Realizing that the parachute is nice, it captures the air and slows you down. Having a hole at the top will allow the air to escape and will stop the parachute from doing this waffling motion on the way back down, which makes it more dangerous. So they invent the modern parachute, modern flexible parachute inside this building in San Francisco in 1886. And that's a success. They now have the successful device. How do we really test it from altitude to make sure it's going to work before we do it with a human? And unfortunately, they go up aloft with a small dog. They tie the dog up to the parachute and push the dog over the side of the balloon. And sure enough, the dog survives this 3,000-foot fall. Probably not a very happy dog at the end of that experience. But no harm comes to the dog, so it must be okay for humans. Who's going to be the first to do this? Is it Baldwin or is it Van Tassel? And clearly Baldwin has more experience with tightrope walking and high altitude acts. Baldwin says, I'll do it. And so Park says, go ahead, we'll split the rewards. Baldwin immediately goes and contacts a local trolley company in San Francisco with the opportunity of asking that trolley company to pay Baldwin $1 for every foot altitude he goes up to jump. Why a trolley company? Because they're going to do this parachute jumping act at the end of one of these trolley stops, so that everyone in town who wants to see this has to take the trolley. They come to this trolley stop. Their trolley company is going to make a lot of money. Share a little bit of that reward with me. Will be great. Trolley company pays them $1,000, which in 1887 was $30,000 to do this. I'm not sure I would take $30,000 to jump out of a balloon today with a parachute, but Baldwin was keen to do it. And they made the arrangements. And on January 30th, 1887, at the Cliff House, using Van Tassel's tethered Eclipse balloon, Baldwin went up in the balloon and jumped out. making the first successful parachute jump in Western US history. And likely that's the first parachute jump since Keel's 1819 jump on the East Coast. There's no photos of that other than these two that we're able to find. On the left, you'll see Baldwin standing on the edge of the basket, and you can see this little parachute that's connected to the balloon. When Baldwin jumps, the force of his gravity will pull that parachute free from the balloon, and here you can see it free with Baldwin barely visible in the photo coming down. Of course, given all this weight is now no longer associated with the balloon goes skyrocketing up, and since it was tethered, it could be brought back down. On these experiments, Baldwin and Van Tassel were assisted by another gentleman, William Ivy, who was masquerading at the time as Baldwin's brother, Ivy Baldwin. Both the Baldwins then decided rather quickly to take this concept of parachuting from balloons and travel back to Thomas Baldwin's hometown of Quincy, Illinois, then to New York City, and then to London, making parachute jumps as exhibitions. By the time they get to London, they are international superstars for having done this. Huge crowds, hundreds of thousands of people pay to watch ball exhibits all throughout. And Van Tassel is left wondering, hey, we had a deal. What happened here? My exhibitionist, who I trusted, is now gone with my idea and is now making money elsewhere. Either I get to do this on my own, I'm not sure I want to do that, or I have to come up with some other way of making money because I want to still make my career as an aerial exhibitionist. By the way, when Baldwin was in Britain, he patented the parachute. Unknown to Van Tassel, this is the patent, and you see the hole in the top of the parachute. There's no record of Van Tassel ever being asked for permission on that one or getting compensated for that patent. Van Tassel was contacted rather quickly by an editor of the San Francisco Examiner newspaper, a very popular newspaper at the time, to take a photographer aloft in one of Van Tassel's balloons and take pictures of what it looks like, what the city looks like from the air, because everyone had now seen balloons go up and knows what that looks like, but no one had ever seen what it looked like to look back down on the city before, except for the balloonists. So taking these pictures, these were the first aerial photos ever taken in California's history. They repeated the same idea for the Los Angeles Examiner later that same year, and these were the first aerial photos of LA. The editor that came up with that idea was a very young editor by the name of William Randolph Hearst, who had just at age 24 become the editor of the San Francisco Examiner. So this helps catapult Hearst's career for doing such amazing photos in his newspaper, very popular at the time. The only photo we know of those two is this one of LA from 1887, and you can make out some landmarks like LA Plaza and LA River in the background. Of course, this is quite more developed today than back then, but you get the idea of what the city looked like at the time from a balloon. Van Tassel yet goes on another tour. He's like a rock star. He goes to San Jose. He's scheduled to make a parachute jump for the first time, but some accident happens and the parachute releases from the balloon before the balloons get launched, and there's no jump at all. He just goes up and makes a balloon flight. Whether that was an accident or nerves, we're not really sure. He makes a new balloon called the National in 1888, and he brings that to San Diego for the first time. So at that time, San Diego had just received the railway, and so it could be reached by rail. He made a successful balloon flight from one side of the San Diego Bay to the other side of San Diego Bay in April of 1888, just shortly after the Hotel del Coronado was constructed. His wife number 3, Clara, wondered, hey, you know, Park, if you don't have the courage to make one of these parachute jumps, I do. And I don't know if any other woman has ever done this before, but I want to make a parachute jump. Park was not at all really pleased with that idea, but Clara convinced him. So on July 4th, yet another July 4th experience, 1888 in Los Angeles, they make announcements that Clara is going to make a jump, the first parachute jump by a woman. Word gets out that this is going to happen, and there are people in Los Angeles that think that this is not appropriate for a woman to be making a parachute jump. And it's so crazy that it's not appropriate for anyone to commit suicide on Independence Day. So they sent the police to stop this event from happening. Word gets back to the Van Tassels that the police are coming. So instead of launching at 2 in the afternoon, they launch at 10:47 in the morning to avoid the police. Up they go to 5,000 feet, and they drift slightly from downtown Los Angeles over Pasadena near Arroyo Seco, and Clara Van Tassel jumps out, successfully landing down near Arroyo Seco, making the first parachute jump by a woman in Western America. That event, that Clara was so brave to do this, not only makes national news, but international news for the next 6 months. The word gets back to Baldwin in the UK that Clara Van Tassel is now his arch rival back in America. And she's an international superstar right away, but no one has. Park was not at all happy that happened. Having a heart attack watching his wife jump out doing this parachute jump that he's not even sure is going to actually work. That was horrifying for Park. He doesn't want it to ever happen again. He goes and tries to attempt another launch in San Jose. Again, insufficient gas. It doesn't work. Something happens with the balloon. All the paying customers are wondering, hey, how are you going to pay me back my money? And this huge melee, this amazing ruckus happens at this launch, and Clara and Park barely come out of that with their lives. So very difficult times. Right away, he makes another tour. Park leaves Clara back in the Bay Area, says, I'll do the parachute jumping from now on, and goes off to Seattle. He finally makes a parachute jump on his own, his first one, a very horrifying parachute jump. He jumps out of the balloon. The parachute fails to open for the first 500 feet of the fall. And then all of a sudden it opens with tremendous force. And he's hanging onto this iron ring that's supporting the parachute. And that force nearly loses his grip on the ring. The newspapers report that the best part of this experience was watching the man dangle by one arm. It's crazy, suspenseful. Is he going to die or not? But he survives. He comes back to San Francisco and makes another jump near where the first jump had happened with Baldwin. February 10th of 1889, and again, similar kind of event. It doesn't open right away. Nearly kills him on the way back down, and it just is not for him. He doesn't want to be doing this anymore. Why risk my life doing this parachute jumping thing, even though people are paying more money? Here's a picture of what it might have looked like. This is a balloon being inflated near the Cliff House. We're not exactly sure that this is Park's flight, but you get the idea of lots and lots of people coming out to turn out to watch these events. He's hired by a group in Salt Lake City in 1889 to make parachute jumps at some considerable amount of expense. You can even see in the advertising, the Great Van Tassel, who's been engaged at great expense. They're advertising the fact they paid a lot of money for this guy. He better do it. He comes out to Salt Lake City by rail, and upon arrival realizes he's brought the wrong balloon. He's brought Clara's balloon, which is smaller, and it's such a small balloon that Park's a kind of heavier set. Man, it's not enough to take him up aloft anyway. Yet he's said he's going to do this, so he's in trouble. And when he arrives, he finds that there's two competitors already doing balloon launches and parachute jumps. There's a gentleman named James Price and his woman jumper named Millie Viola. It's his act, it's Park's act, but now someone else is doing it at Salt Lake City at the same time. Competition. So what to do? He's already been paid. He's got to do something. He goes to a saloon, and he finds in the saloon a gentleman named Dudley Cochran, who happens to be talking to his friends about this Van Tassel guy and how it's never going to happen and how he's a fraud. And Van Tassel goes up to Dudley Cochran and says, I'm not a fraud, but I have a problem, and I'll pay you $400 if you go up and do the balloon flight and the parachute jump as if it's me, Park Van Tassel. And Dudley Cochran had never been in a balloon, never seen a balloon, but $400 is $400. And so he takes the money and says, sure, explain to me how you're going to do this, how we're going to do this. So up he goes. He goes up in the balloon higher than the clouds, jumps out of the balloon, comes back down through the clouds of the parachute, and successfully lands in the Great Salt Lake and gets rescued. Everyone in Salt Lake City thinks that was Park Van Tassel. No one knows it was Dudley Cochran. And Dudley didn't own up to that until later on in a newspaper report out of Nebraska that I found. But amazing that you would just find someone out of the saloon to teach them how to do this, and off they go and go jump out of a balloon. This is what life was like in 1889. Park Van Tassel continues, tries to make a balloon jump, extension and a parachute jump in 1889, July 4th in Albuquerque, this time with a new aeronaut, a gentleman named Joe Lawrence, who was masquerading as Van Tassel's brother, Joe Van Tassel. But again, there was failure with the balloon to get it launched. And Albuquerque wonders if Van Tassel's for real or not now. They know he's their local hero of being the first one to fly, but can't ever get it to work again. What's going on? They leave Albuquerque without a lot of fanfare, and Park clearly not the one doing the jumping anymore. This gentleman, Joe Van Tassel's the one doing the jumping, much younger. And on the way back to San Francisco by rail, they make stops at different cities to practice. They stop at Santa Monica and Los Angeles and Fresno and Visalia, making balloon ascensions and parachute jumps. By the time they get to San Francisco, Joe Lawrence knows what he's doing. And they've now realized that it's possible to travel the American West by rail, but that's a small part of the world. And I wonder if we can take this technology and this tour to the rest of the world and make more money. Meanwhile, Baldwin is now back from the UK, touring around America, making balloon ascensions and parachute jumps in competition with Van Tassel. He comes back to Albuquerque in 1889, and after 2 failures, finally makes a correct ascension at the Territorial Fair. So now there's this race in America and in the world to see who could be the first to get to the next biggest city, to make an exhibition for paying customers, and then go to the next one. And really, it's a competition, a race around the world to see who can bring ballooning there and parachuting there first. One thing to do it by rail, but it's one thing to do it by boat. So they leave San Francisco by boat with the first objective of landing in the Hawaiian Islands in Oahu. They make 2 ascensions, one at Kapiolani Park near Diamond Head and one at Punchbowl here near Pearl Harbor. Joe Lawrence is the one doing the jumping now. And on November 2nd, 1889, Joe goes up at Kapiolani Park in a balloon, jumps out, lands back at the park, the first successful parachute jump in all of Hawaii's history, generating quite a sensation that this has happened. They realized that King Kalakawa's birthday was coming up 2 weeks later, so why not make an ascension and a balloon parachute jump for the king to honor him before we go on the next part of our tour. If you're familiar with Hawaii, though, of course, the higher up you go in the air, the stronger the winds get. And in Hawaii, the trade winds are often blowing out of the northeast. Given that's the fact, people asked Joe, do you want to take a life preserver along with you to go up, because you might end up in the water, and if you do, maybe a life preserver is a good idea. And so Joe said, I'm jumping in front of the king. I'm not taking a life preserver with me. So he launches with this balloon, and sure enough, the trade winds are pretty strong that day. He starts going out to sea over Honolulu and out towards the ocean with this balloon. Realizing what's happening, he releases from the balloon, but the winds are so strong, it carries both the balloon and the parachute out over to the water, and they land in the ocean. And unfortunately, Joe Lawrence is never seen again. He drowns as a part of that exhibition, probably because the iron ring that he was holding onto or tied to was so heavy that it immediately sunk. But that was quite a tragedy. Having just started their journey, this international journey starting in Hawaii, they have this tragedy right away of Joe's passing. And as they go try to rescue Joe, these boats leave Honolulu all to go rescue this aviator. They notice that there's sharks in the water near Pearl Harbor. And of course, then the stories become that the aviator was eaten by sharks. And the stories get even worse, where the sharks are jumping out of the water as the parachutist was coming down and eat him alive. And the news travels around the world that this aviator unfortunately passed in such a horrific way. This is a journal from France you see on the right. There was considerable confusion. Was this Park Van Tassel that had died? No one had heard of Joe Van Tassel before internationally, but they'd heard of Park Van Tassel. And Park Van Tassel had to say, no, it's actually Joe that had passed away. A terrible thing. So Park is now left wondering again, how do I continue on? Who's going to do the jumping? Am I going to do the jumping? And are we going to continue this tour or not? And sure enough, they continue on. They had clearly made arrangements already to continue the exhibitions in Australia. And the manager, the stage manager, Frank Frost, and Park Van Tassel continue by steamer to Sydney from Honolulu. And they meet up with James Price, the same gentleman that had been a competitor at Salt Lake City, is now joining Van Tassel on this tour. It's likely that at Salt Lake they had combined forces and said, let's take this internationally. They had scheduled a whole series of exhibitions throughout Australia. I'm not going to go into the details of all of these, but I just want to point out the map that says they arrive in Sydney, they go to Melbourne, Ballarat, Bendigo, Adelaide, up to Brisbane, all up the Gold Coast to Townsville, and then up into Asia. And I'll talk about that coming up. These jumps in Australia, though, were quite amazing for Australia's history. Australia at that time was very hungry for American technology and exhibition. Anything was coming from America was very, very appreciated. And James Price, now masquerading as yet another brother of Park Van Tassel, James Van Tassel, makes the first parachute jump as the Van Tassel troop in December of 1889. It's one of the earliest parachute jumps in Australia's history. They continue on at different locations, adding trapeze work while the balloon is being inflated. Two American sisters, the Frieda sisters, are hired to do trapeze work as to keep the crowd entertained as the balloon's getting ready. These Frieda sisters were very, very brave women. And very quickly, they convince Park Van Tassel and James Price that they too could make flights in balloons and that they too could jump with parachutes, and that no woman had ever done that before in Australia's history. So in February of 1890, Valerie Freitas goes up again as yet another sister now of this growing Van Tassel family, goes up and makes the first parachute jump in Australia by a woman jumping out of one of Park Van Tassel's balloons. And not to be outdone, a week later, Gladys does the same, the second woman to jump in Australia's history. Both of these women are lauded as national heroes of Australia for having done this. And all of a sudden now, considerable attention is focused on this Van Tassel troop. So much so that when they get to Melbourne a month later, there's 100,000 people waiting to see these two women make their jumps. It's now the act in Australia, making considerable amount of money for this traveling exhibition. There aren't many photos of the Van Tassel sisters. I looked very hard with the National Library of Australia and the State Library of Victoria. I did find this one photo of Gladys Freitas. Unfortunately, it was listed as Gladys Mantasso, yet another bastardization of the Van Tassel name, but we finally figured out it was actually her. These are incredible stories at this time that were in the newspapers. You get to see a sense of they're just jingling trapeze with the parachute below the balloon. They pull a rope and down they come. And the balloon at this time was hot air balloon. It's inflated over a hot air fire. They connect the parachute, the lady jumps in the trapeze, up it goes. When they release, this hot air balloon is going to release its hot air and come back down on its own. No other person is associated with that balloon. Just a means to get up into the air. They continue on with these fabulous Van Tassel sisters making their tour. At Adelaide, they have a great set of jumps in May of 1890. But at that same event, Van Tassel and James Price have a falling out about the troop management of how to schedule things and how to manage things. And Park and the Van Tassel sisters continue on in one direction, and James Price and Frank Frost and Millie Viola, the lady that was jumping in Utah, who's now jumping in Australia, continue on a different tour of Australia doing this act. They split. In Brisbane, in Queensland, Australia, unfortunately, it was the case that, as you can see here, there's an enclosure that's been erected for paying customers on the inside of the enclosure and non-paying customers on the outside, helping with this balloon inflation. It turned out that there are these poles that help keep the balloon in place over the fire. It's very difficult and dangerous to do. And unfortunately, during this erection of the balloon in Brisbane in 1890, one of these poles fell during this setting up the balloon, and it fell directly on a young boy, killing him instantly in the crowd. And of course, that was a tragedy, another tragedy of this tour. Led to a court case. Was it malice? Was it just an accident? It was determined it was just an accident. And as a result of that, the enclosure distance was increased to keep the spectators further away from things like poles. They continued on. They went to Townsville. At Townsville, there was another set of circumstances that happened. The Australian Defence Force happened to be marching in town that day. And of course, you're going to march somewhere, so you might as well march to where this balloon is going to go up, because no one's seen a balloon go up before with a parachute jumper. There were complaints that were filed by a Reverend Stewart. They were doing this on a Sunday, and this is the day of rest. Why would we be doing any exhibitions on the day of rest? There was another complaint because one of the majors in the Australian Defence Force, a married major, provided a bouquet to Gladys Van Tassel before she left to go up on this tour. And that was, again, steeped in heresy that some married man would do this. But despite all the complaints, because of Gladys's heroism of making the flight here in Townsville, there was a street dedicated in her honor. That street still exists today, Van Tassel Street in Townsville. Off they go from the north part of Australia up into Asia, Southeast Asia, and they continue on all the way from New Mexico to Southeast Asia. They go to Indonesia, to Singapore, to Shanghai, to the Philippines, off to Georgetown, and then to Burma and off to India. And again, I'm not going to go belabor all of these different stops, but despite to say that Gladys and Park are doing this part of the tour, Valerie took a break from this aerial exhibition. They make what's believed to be the first balloon ascension and parachute jump in Shanghai's history by anyone, clearly likely the first parachute jump by a woman in China's history, making all these great ascensions. Now, here's Park Van Tassel touring on the world, getting national and international news for having traveling with two other women. And Clara Corkendall, his unfortunate wife is left in the Bay Area wondering what's going on with my husband. So Clara was granted a divorce at that time by desertion from Park to get on with her life in her own way, which is unfortunate as the first woman to have jumped in U.S. Western parachute history. There were many competitors, and again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about each of these, but I just want to stress to you, it's like the Great Race movie that combined with Around the World in 80 Days. These people were really in a tight race to see who could get to the next biggest city fast. And there were countries like Japan that were very interested in this technology from a military perspective. So Emperor Meiji in the Meiji Restoration in Japan really wanted to have any Western technology come and be demonstrated for him to see how it could be used in times of war, and would pay handsomely for that. Percival Spencer, a jumper from the UK, was doing that for Emperor Meiji, and Baldwin and William Ivey did the same. James Franklin continued from Australia and went to New Zealand and other locations. There were several others in this race. And it really was the case. If you were number 2 or number 3 to the city, you'd earn less money as a part of your exhibition. The Van Tassel troop continues on from Burma to India. All of these dots where the red dot were places where they jumped. Again, I'm not going to go into the details. There's probably many more that I didn't get a chance to find that were just not recorded in history, but all over India. Valerie rejoins the troop at this time, and she makes what's believed to be the first parachute jump by a woman in India's history at Hyderabad in 1891. However, as they were making an ascension at Mysore, the balloon burst at like 40 feet. The balloon just broke in half. And Valerie jumped quickly with the parachute, just enough time to inflate the parachute and stop her fall. She barely survived that event. And after several of these demonstrations with Park and this, is it working, is it not working? They decide to marry 2 very wealthy Indians and leave Park Van Tassel again. Park is now left wondering who's doing the jumping. I'm back to my central problem of my existence in this tour. I don't really want to be the one doing the jumping. Who's going to jump for me? He travels to London. He makes a very good arrangement with a newspaper called the London Graphic to get a very large balloon and make a journey in balloon all the way across all of India and have that be recorded in the newspapers of the London Graphic. While that balloon is being generated, he comes back to India. There are different stories of Park Van Tassel returning to India. Clearly, there were people masquerading as Park Van Tassel trying to make money doing these aerial exhibitions, not knowing what they were doing. One of those people masquerading made a parachute jump in Calcutta, and in the Ganges, was traveling downstream very, very fast, nearly drowned, had to get rescued. Clearly, that wasn't Park Van Tassel because he was still in London at the time. So many people were wanting to take the name and make money through these exhibitions. But Park Van Tassel did return. He returned to Bombay in 1891 in the fall with yet another parachute jumper, a lady named Jeanette Rummery, who is now masquerading as Jeanette Van Tassel, yet another relation to Van Tassel, but quite younger than Park. So it wasn't clear if they were married, or if she was his daughter, what's the relation, but in the newspapers it waffles, but clearly there was no real relation. They may have been married, but there's no certificate that we've ever been able to find. They make parachute jumps, again, all through India. Here's the picture of at a studio in Calcutta with a very dapper Park Van Tassel on the right. Again, very fantastic photos from a long time ago. Jeanette, another very courageous woman, making jumps all over India for paying customers. At Dhaka, which is now the capital of Bangladesh, at the time it was part of India, she made a very, very wonderful flight, but ended in tragedy. So in March of 1892, she launches from the Asnan Manzil. This is effectively a very big palace on the river at Dhaka, a very big institution at the local area. She makes a great, beautiful launch, makes a great parachute jump, and unfortunately lands in a tree at what's called Ramna Park, a park that still exists today. Very large castle around a tree. Natives come with bamboo poles to try to rescue her out of this tree. And during the rescue, one of the poles breaks and she falls out of the tree and suffers severe head injuries and dies as a result 2 days later from those injuries. She's buried in Dhaka and considered by people, the aviation historians in Bangladesh, as the first person to have ever flown in Bangladesh's history. But yet again, here's another tragedy on this tour. And yet again, there's international news. The death was now incorrectly attributed to Gladys or Valerie Van Tassel because no one knew about Jeanette Van Tassel, who she And people in Australia were wondering, oh my goodness, Valerie died. It's such a shame. So fake news all around the world, but it really was, unfortunately, Jenny that had passed away. Van Tassel makes several trips between London and India. This time he's kind of adrift in India. He marries again, a lady named Edith Ann Nolan, wife number 4. But by 1894, he's off again on another tour, this time off to Ceylon in Sri Lanka, making the first balloon flight and parachute jump in Sri Lanka's history. So if you are an aviation historian in Sri Lanka, you know Van Tassel as the first person to do that. But unfortunately, people in Sri Lanka know nothing about Van Tassel's history in the American West because they don't know that he came from there. He's just their first aviator in Sri Lanka's history. He travels from Sri Lanka to Zanzibar on the east coast of Africa, then to South Africa, and then up into Iran, Persia, up to Russia, and then to Europe, making balloon exhibitions and parachute jumps for paying customers. Again, not going to go into the details of all these, but fantastic flights, especially for the Shah of Iran. The Shah gives him a beautiful sword and makes him a general in the Persian army for these wonderful feats that he did for the Shah in Tehran. Makes this fabulous tour of Europe and comes back and returns to India in 1895, living much of his life then in India. But in October of 1900, he has a stroke and returns to California. The world was in a global depression at that time. It was harder and harder to make aerial exhibitions for an aging man who had just had a stroke. So he returns to California for better health care and to kind of start life anew. He returns to California, though, and California and the West are very different than when he left, especially when it comes to airplanes and aerial navigation. By that time, now, dirigibles are the thing. There was a gentleman named August Grieth who had been experimenting with dirigibles, powered balloons, in the San Francisco Bay Area, making one called the California Eagle and flying that in 1904. He hired Thomas Baldwin, the same gentleman I've been talking about before, as his aeronaut because Baldwin had this experience. And through that relationship, Baldwin now learned all about dirigible technology, how to make a motor that would work, how to spin propellers. The propellers being used on these dirigibles, though, were terribly inefficient. They were like taking a ceiling fan and putting it on the side and having it power the dirigible forward. Very, very difficult way of getting any kind of motion to happen for a big cigar sausage-shaped thing in the sky. So Baldwin wanted to know, how do I get a more efficient propeller design? How do I get this dirigible technology to work? Because Baldwin recognized rather quickly that the dirigible represented the next leap in performance and next leap in experimentation. And just as he had taken the parachute idea from Van Tassel, dirigibles were where he's going to go next. He finds a gentleman named Professor John Montgomery, who I've studied and written about in a different book. And together they perfect propeller design through wind tunnel experiments at Santa Clara College in the Bay Area. And with that new propeller, Baldwin goes and makes dirigibles that are now far more better powered than most. But Baldwin says to Montgomery, hey, you might want to take your gliders that you're interested in experimenting with, hoist them aloft with a balloon, and then release from the balloon and glide back down. People will pay a lot of money to see that. It's like parachute jumping, but with a controlled glider. That's pretty cool. So they form a contract to do this, but Baldwin immediately takes the propeller concept, applies that to his own new dirigible called the California Aero, takes that to the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, and with another pilot, wins the World's Fair for $100,000 prize for the longest flight by a dirigible, not sharing any of that reward with Grieth or Montgomery. Briefly, though, Montgomery continues this aerial exhibition with gliders and balloons and finds Van Tassel in the Bay Area using one of Van Tassel's balloons to hoist aloft the glider, like is shown here, to release the glider and come back down to Earth, showing that heavier than air flight was now possible, not powered, but just as a glider. Of course, the Wright brothers had flown by that time, but they had done that with power on the East Coast and were really rather private about how they were still doing it. No one at this time had made a public flight until Montgomery's flight with a dirigible, with a glider under a balloon like this in 1905 in the Bay Area. Just as all that fun is starting and Van Tassel is now getting a new start in ballooning with gliding, the Great Quake happens in 1906. At the time, he was living in Oakland, and in order to keep his life going, he went back to that idea of tethered weddings and ascensions, and that's about all you could do after the quake, as the whole economy in the Bay Area shut down. He briefly returned to Salt Lake City to try to make a parachute jump in 1906, but competitors, vandals, destroyed his balloon, cut slits in his balloon before it could be used the night before. And he just kind of gave up on the idea. If the competition was too fierce, and he didn't want to do the parachuting anyway, and there must be a better way of making a living. He realized by that time now he's an elder statesman of ballooning. He's been all around the world. It's really much like the Around the World in 80 Days character. And he has considerable experience having done this. So he helps form two aeronautic clubs in the Bay Area, the Pacific Aero Club and the Oakland Aero Club, designed specifically for recreational ballooning. Lots of people were now interested in, I want to do this. It's not just an impossible art that one person can do, but whole clubs can do this together and enjoy ballooning for recreation, for fun. They make a very large balloon called the City of Oakland with many impressive flights. The first flight was on August 14th, 1909, taking off from downtown Oakland and then landing in a very precarious way near Pleasanton to the east of Oakland in a 40-knot breeze. Typically anything over like 5 knots or 10 knots is a lot of wind for a balloon to land in. 40 knots is you almost might die landing in that balloon. They get dragged along the ground in the basket, but they survive. Here's a photo of what that looked like. This is the City of Oakland being prepared in downtown Oakland before that launch in 1909. And here it is just clearing the steeple after launch just nearby. He helped set up balloon races. These are some of the first balloon races in America's history. The Portola Cup, which was a Bay Area balloon race. Again, harrowing adventures of water landings in the Bay Area, landings in swamps, all sorts of things. He gets hired by the Goodyear Rubber Company to assist with advertising. They want to advertise their Goodyear tires on top of buildings in downtown San Francisco, but it's a very windy place. I wonder if you could make a dirigible shaped advertising balloon that we could put up on top of the building and have it be tethered there. And these were some of Goodyear's first forays in small scale dirigibles or blimps that later then led to the Goodyear blimps we know today. At Oakland, Van Tassel married again, a lady by the name of A.F. Barr. We're not sure of her first name. That was wife number 5 in 1912. And of course, unfortunately, as we're going through a pandemic, there was a pandemic back then too, the flu pandemic of 1918. And Van Tassel, now an elderly man, was probably staying inside a lot. No vaccine at the time. So what to do? He invents a mechanical toy. This is a little rubber band slingshot. You can slingshot the parachutist up into the sky, and it comes back down as a toy for kids. He patented that, and it was approved in 1921. In his later years, he becomes a caretaker for a very large estate in the 1920s, leading into the Great Depression. But during the Great Depression, he ends up moving back to live with Oakland with his sister. It's all he could afford. And unfortunately, in October of 1930, he passed away of a heart attack at Oakland at that house. His passing made national news that Park Van Tassel, the great Park Van Tassel, had passed away. But as it was throughout much of his life, they got a lot of the story wrong in his obituary. Even his name, Parks Van Tassel, was wrong, or that he had first jumped in Kansas City, which wasn't true. Almost everything about it, something was wrong. But at least he made the news in the New York Times and Chicago Tribune and Time Magazine. At least they recorded that he had passed away. So just to summarize, here we have a gentleman that really got his start in aviation in New Mexico with his first flight in Albuquerque. And all the way through to his last flights in Oakland, he had this amazing life, amazing journey, very dedicated to this very odd aerial exhibition life on the road. But during a time of transition in human flight from the impossible art of lighter than air aircraft that no one had ever seen before, and showing that to New Mexico for the first time, to powered flight being possible, heavier than air powered flight being possible, dirigibles, and now flight being recreational. And even into World War I, where aircraft were used for war. I mean, that was still a part of his life. To be able to witness that kind of a transition was just an amazing thing. A pioneer in both ballooning and in parachuting, inventor of the modern parachute. Very difficult to piece together that story because his life was so fast, and newspapers would record only the events of he's doing a parachute to jump today, that he'd be gone the next day from the newspapers. And I had to then go trace where would the train route go next, and maybe where he'd go, and oh, he's there, and okay. And piecing together that history was difficult, which made it rather difficult for other historians to appreciate in the past this gentleman's life because it hadn't been ever pieced together before. And it's also amazing to think that just 30 years after Van Tassel died in 1930, by 1960, we had a gentleman named Joseph Kittinger parachuting from a balloon that went up to 100,000 feet, the edge of space, in an astronaut suit, coming back down to Earth with a parachute over New Mexico. So, only 30 years after Van Tassel died, this amazing event of going up into space and coming back down was possible. And my friend and colleague Dick Brown mentioned that Van Tassel took ballooning to the world, but now the ballooning world comes back to Albuquerque. It's now the hub, the international hub of ballooning activity, all starting with Park Van Tassel. So it turns out, as I researched this story, that because Van Tassel passed away during the Great Depression, his family, his sister, could not afford a marker on Van Tassel's grave. I did a lot of research to find out where he was buried in Oakland. I now know where he's buried, and that grave is absolutely deserving of a marker for such an amazing life. Also, I feel like the location of his first ascension in Albuquerque, a parking lot in downtown that's just unmarked and no one knows the history of that site, is absolutely deserving as of recognition as a city-state historic site. And of course, these women that were associated with him, not only his brave wives, but the brave women aeronauts that were courageous enough to jump out of a balloon with a parachute, are all deserving of this recognition, especially in the nations for which they're first. So I started up a GoFundMe campaign to put a marker on Van Tassel's grave this year. I hope to get that done this year very soon, and any money that it might be left over from this, we're going to put towards markers in Albuquerque to keep the honors going for Van Tassel. I encourage you to look this up if you can. If you can donate, we would really appreciate it. We do know that there was a scrapbook that Van Tassel came back to the U.S. with after all of his journeys through India and Africa and Iran. He had collected all that stuff into one scrapbook. And newspaper journalists record this in their conversations in the 1900s with Van Tassel, but that scrapbook made it back to Oakland and now is disappeared. We don't know where it is. So if you ever see that scrapbook show up and you're hearing this recording, please report the scrapbook to either the Balloon Museum in Albuquerque or the Oakland Museum because it deserves to be preserved. That's an amazing resource that we couldn't have. I did have the pleasure of writing this book. It took 4 years to research and write up. Published with the University of New Mexico Press, fabulous press to work with. It has a glossary of ballooning terms for those that are uninitiated like I was to start this process. Dick Brown really helped me in learning all these terms. And if you're interested, you can purchase that through the University of New Mexico Press. But I do want to thank so many people on this journey that I took to get this research done, not only folks in Albuquerque and in New Mexico, but all around the world that helped with newspaper accounts, other types of events, pictures. It became its own event. When I talked to people at the National Library of Australia, they got very interested in learning more about the women aviators and researching it and then reporting back. Even descriptions that were written in Chinese or in Japanese had very fortunately translated for me by students at Macquarie University and then given back to me in English so I could interpret them as part of the story. So it was a very huge amount of teamwork that made this possible all across the world, and I really appreciate the help of everyone listed here. Most importantly, though, of course, the University of New Mexico Press was fabulous in getting this actually produced. They were great reviewers, and the Balloon Museum in Albuquerque was, again, wonderful, not only to get the book and its history promoted and helped me promote it at the last Balloon Fiesta, and hopefully we'll be out there again in October, COVID willing, later this year. I want to thank my family and my two partners in crime, Dick Brown, again, Hall of Fame balloonist, and Rick Van Tassel, the indirect Van Tassel descendant of Park, but also Van Tassel family historian. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, and thank you very much for your time and attention.
Well, thank you, Gary. What an incredible amount of research. That was fascinating. I loved the maps and photos, really brought this history to life. We will take questions now from the audience. If anyone has questions for Gary, go ahead and unmute yourself, and then you can just feel free to ask. I have one in the meantime. Oh, go ahead, Deborah.
I just want to say it's, I don't have a question. I just want to thank you because this is really fascinating.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate it. There's a little bit of feedback. So it'll be helpful. Thanks. I do want to say that I started this journey because I gave a lecture in Moriarty, New Mexico at the Southwest Story Museum, because I had written a book about gliding history about this Montgomery character and was giving a lecture out there. And Dick Brown came to that lecture armed with a USB stick with some PDFs that he had saved, newspaper clippings that he and Rick had saved about Van Tassel's history. He handed me the USB stick, said, "Take a look at this. You should write a book about Van Tassel." And I the Van Tassel name was kind of familiar because of the balloon glider thing, but I was like, "Who's the Van Tassel guy?" I started looking at the PDFs, and it was clear right away that there were so many different locations that he had flown from that it was like a ginormous jigsaw puzzle, but I only had 10 pieces of the 1,000-piece puzzle. And that alone made the research really fun, because every puzzle piece led to 3 new puzzle pieces. And so thank you for saying thank you, but it was also really fun to do that puzzle journey.
Actually, I do have one question tied to that.
Please.
The whole time, I, of course, kept thinking about Around the World in 80 Days. I'm sure you looked to see if there was any inspiration for it that came from him. I assume you just couldn't find anything?
Great question. And I don't know if you're watching the show that's on PBS at the moment, but I'm enjoying it. So you can watch Around the World in 80 Days Sunday nights on PBS. No, so there were several authors at the time that were helping to romanticize ballooning, Jules Verne being one of them. There were others. Edgar Allan Poe wrote about the romantic ballooning flights and journeys with balloons. It's clear, of course, that might have influenced Park in his interest in ballooning, but there's no direct correlation that I've been able to find that said that was the reason why they wanted to go international, for instance. I think it was much more around the line of, this is my career, how do I make more money? And I've already covered all the American West, and they all know me, and I've been to almost every major city on the rails. Where do I go next? What do I add? What do I do? And going on a steamer is the next thing. So I don't think there's any direct connection. As I understand it, in the original book, Around the World in 80 Days, there's actually no balloon. It was the movie adaptation of the book that added the balloon. And of course, the TV adaptation that I just watched and I'm watching includes the balloon. So it's just a period piece thing, that ballooning at that time was a very romantic and new technology, like SpaceX is today. We'd all go watch a SpaceX launch if it was nearby. We might pay money to go see it.
Fascinating. What is your writing process like, Gary? You did so much research on this.
Yeah, great question. And yeah, this is something that I would love to try to automate, because it was a lot of work. So this in particular, I should start over again. I wrote a book back in 2000 called Wind and Wings, The History of Soaring in San Diego, since I'm based in San Diego, local gliding history in the area. And that was a very arduous task, because at that time, in 2000, there weren't newspapers that had been digitized, and everything was go down to the local museum and look through folders and get copies of things and actually, do it all manually, which was, wow, a lot of work. Maybe microfiche if you were lucky. Now there's so much that's been digitized, and it's amazing that, like, the Library of Congress makes available tremendous volumes of newspapers that are easily searchable and then savable as PDFs. So my first pass through is to do keyword searches on that kind of data, collect as many PDFs as I possibly can that match the keywords. I did that not only through the Library of Congress across through all the Western states, but the National Library of Australia has a similar database called Trove, also amazing. And very fortunately for me, I was doing a lot of work in the Bay Area, stopping at Stanford University. They have fabulous connection to newspaper databases for India and Southeast Asia that are searchable. And so really, I spent the first year or so simply trying to trace his journey and collect as many PDFs of newspapers as possible. Then I went through and started accounting all those into a chronology, and then tried my best to look at primary source information where Van Tassel was quoted or wrote articles himself. There weren't many. There are several interviews where he gives a pretty good detail about where he went. Taking that as the primary tree of where things went, try to then piece the chronology together to fit that. And of course, just as there's fake news today, there's fake news back then. I think there's more fake news back then than there is now, which is kind of hard to believe, but true. So there's a lot of stuff that was written that was just wrong. And of course, when you read that Park Van Tassel got carried away in the Ganges River and nearly died, you're like, oh my God, the guy nearly died for like the third time. This is incredible. And then like a month later, you're like, it couldn't have been him. He was in London. What's going on? I gotta, how can that be? And so you fake yourself out thinking that you believe everything, and you have to realize what was wrong and what was right. So it took another 2 years to figure all that out, and then took a year to get a publisher that was fantastic to work with and get it edited and finalized.
Well, it really has come full circle, as Dick Brown said. Van Tassel took ballooning to the world, and now the world of ballooning comes to Albuquerque. Thank you, Gary, for sharing your knowledge on the history of ballooning and your time tonight. It's just fascinating. I'm so thankful that your book has preserved this important part of our Western history.
Thank you, Sandra. I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Are there any other questions for Gary tonight? I want to just give a reminder to join us next time for our author series with Dr. Barbara Koltuska-Haskin, who's here tonight, as she presents her book, How My Brain Works, A Guide to Understanding It Better and Keeping It Healthy. And the GoFundMe, like Gary said, is online. I was going to put a link in here, but if you just... I'll
do it right there. If you just...
there it is.
Either use the QR code on the right if you're so inclined, or you can look up Park Van Tassel Grave Marker on GoFundMe. I'll take you right to this page.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Gary. Good night. And if you're ever in Corrales, come visit us at the library. Love to have you.
Sandra. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. Will do. All right. Bye now.
Good night.